O city, city, ornament of the earth, eye of the world, glory of Jad's creation, will I die before I see you again? To say of a man that he was sailing to Sarantine was to say that his life was on the cusp of change, poised for emergent greatness, brilliance, fortune, or else at the very precipice of a final and absolute fall as he met something too vast for his capacity. This, in turn, might have had occasioned a significant change in various affairs, both personal and of much wider import. It could, in fact, have changed his life and a number of other lives, and arguably the course of events in the Empire. This happens more often than is sometimes suspected. Lovers first meet at a dinner one almost failed to attend. A wine barrel falling from a wagon breaks the leg of someone who chose an impulsive route to his usual bathhouse. An assassin's thrown dagger fails to kill only because the intended victim turns, randomly, and sees it coming. The tides of fortune and the lives of men and women in the gods' created world are shaped and altered in such a fashion. Crispin didn't come back to the inn. But to be remembered through others, even our own heirs, is also to be misremembered, is it not? What child knows his father? Who decides how we are recorded, or if we are? And so the world changes. It changes in every moment, of course, but there are degrees of change. There were those in the Hippodrome that day for whom the racing held more importance than mighty events of war and succession and holy faith. It is always so. The apprentice, decades after, might recall an announcement of war as having taken place the day the chambermaid finally went up to the loft with him. The long-awaited birth of a healthy child will resonate more for parents than the report of an invading army on the border or the consecration of a sanctuary. The need to finish the harvest before frost overwhelms any response to the death of kings. A flux in the bowels obliterates the weightiest pronouncements of holy patriarchs. The great events of an age appear to those living through as the backdrops, only to the vastly more compelling dramas of their own lives. And how could it be otherwise? In this same way, many of the men and women there in the Hippodrome, and some who were not, but later claimed to have been, would cling to one private image or another of what transpired. They might be entirely different things, varying moments, for each of us has strings within the soul, and we are played upon in different ways, like instruments. And how could it be otherwise? Hello everyone, we have some more Guy Gavriel Kay content because I have finished the Sarantine Mosaic and I am doing a series review, but in all honesty it's going to sound a lot more like a book review because this reads a lot more like a really big 1100 page book that just it was published as a duology. So I'm in my head I'm referring to this as the Sarantine Mosaic, not thinking them of as much separately as Sailing to Sarantine and Lord of Emperors. But, okay, let's get into this, because right off the bat, this is, in my opinion, the best Guy Gavriel Kay book I have read so far. This beats out The Lions of Our Song, I like it more than Tigana, more than Arbonne, and way more than the Fiona of Our Tapestries. And also, Guy Gavriel Kay really makes it so you can start reading his books wherever the hell you want. And in terms of, reading order, will your experience be affected if you read, in terms of, continuity or plot or anything like that that would matter for reading order if you were looking at a reading order for something like The Cosmere or The First Law World or Realm of the Otherlings? None of that matters. These absolutely stand completely on their own, and you do not need to read Lions of Our Song first, even though they're technically in the same world. That being said, I do think this is probably harder to get into than The Lions of Our Song, and might be one of his more challenging reads. So I could see it being not quite as good of an entry point for Guy Gavriel Kay. And also, when planning to read it, I probably wouldn't leave a pretty big gap in between Sailing to Sarantine and Lord of Emperors, which is actually why I read both this month. I was going to only read this in February and this in March, but then I got to the end of Sailing to Sarantine, and I was kind of like, okay, that doesn't feel like it stands that much on its own. It kind of just feels like the first half of a really damn good book. And so I just went not straight onto Lord of Emperors. I read one book in between them. Also, if I hadn't read Lord of Emperors, no matter what I read, I would have been thinking that I just wanted to read Lord of Emperors. And so it would have just made me like it less. So, what is it about? This is about a alternate version of the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century. For those who don't know, the Byzantine Empire is the Eastern Roman Empire. So Roman Empire got split in two. West half fell and got sacked, and the Eastern Empire stuck around for another 1,000 years or so. 6th century AD is kind of the last point in time where the Byzantine Empire would be like identifiable as Roman, almost. Now, in these books, it's not literally the Byzantine Empire, which can be important because that means the way things end for both larger changes and also more personal stories for characters who are based off real people don't need to end the way they actually did in history. So even if you are really familiar with this period of history, you're going to be surprised by some things, which is one reason why he makes it an alternate version of it, because if you actually just set it in the Byzantine Empire, you can't really do that. Anyways, for now on, I'm going to refer to it by the Sarantine names, so it's the Sarantine Empire, and the Roman Empire was the Rhodian Empire. Whatever. There's also the Sassanid Empire, which it was a real Earth empire. If you've played Attila Total War, you know they're a pain in the ass and declare war on you in your Eastern Rome campaigns. We're getting very off topic. And they're the extremely creatively named Sassanid Empire in this, and they also play a significant role because they played a significant role in that time in history. They were kind of a big deal. And this is very much a political, intrigue-driven story that largely is set around one city, but also it's not all set in one city. And the city would be Sarantine, which would be based off Constantinople, the city of cities, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. And there's a lot of also like factions, because there's chariot racing, and like the city of Sarantine has different factions for these chariot racing that also extends to other ends of life, and it focuses a lot more on the personal dramas and tragedies and triumphs that, to the people who would be living there, those things would be more important to them than the fact that the next 100 years is going to be a time of huge political and social change. Which I had a quote from in the intro that I thought was excellent. And I think that's kind of the idea of a lot of Guy Gavriel Kay's work. It's taking a significant historical event and kind of writing a story on like what it would actually be like to be around at that time. Because, you know, if you lived during the 6th century AD in the Byzantine Empire, you would not, the most important aspects of your life would not be the social changes that are going to come up. It would be whatever the dramas of your life were. And one thing I think Guy Gavriel Kay is actually like exceptionally good at is making you really feel the small, really happy, triumphant moments that happen in normal people's life. Because normal people do not save the world in epic battles. And yet we still have moments of joy. Like little things like, say, someone you really respect in like your field, something that you're passionate at, noticing your work and praising it. He managed to capture little victories and defeats like that so beautifully. Anyways, and this book does have a protagonist, unlike The Lions of Our Song. It has someone who you can look at and be like, this is the protagonist of this book. but it does POV hop like a madman. But the protagonist is Caius Crispin, who lives out in the western half, what used to be the Rhodian or Roman Empire, and he's a mosaicist, which is an artist that's like the little pieces of glass that apparently during the Byzantine Empire was seen as like a very permanent form of art because paintings just didn't last that long. So these were things that people would think of like that could leave a legacy. And he has, before the book started, recently lost his entire family, his wife and children, to the Black Plague, because this time was actually the first time the Black Plague showed up in Europe. And it didn't kill as many people as it did during the 14th century because the cities just weren't designed in a way that caused them to spread that fast, but it still killed a lot of people because it's the Black Plague, and this being post-plague would have affected a huge amount about lives. So yay, living in the 21st century and not the Byzantine Empire or an alternate version of the Byzantine Empire is fun, because as much as, a certain virus sucks, the Black Plague sucked just so much more. Anyways, he's a short-tempered mosaicist who's also one of my favorite characters of all time for a whole number of reasons: development, relationships, the way he sees the world, because both from how his personal tragedy has affected him and also his role as a mosaicist who's extremely passionate, and the way he sees color and his voice. Anyways, that's again off topic. They get a message from a courier that the emperor wants to hire a mosaicist, so he is going to go there. He's going to metaphorically sail to Sarantine, because I know a lot of people really hate nautical fantasy, and you would think that sailing to Sarantine is obviously nautical fantasy. But if you were listening to the intro, you will have heard that the title Sailing to Sarantine is based off figure of speech that just means going to Sarantine, because it's winter and sailing to Sarantine is dangerous, so he'd have to walk to Sarantine. Anyways, and he's gonna be thrust into cutthroat politics of the Byzantine Empire, because oh my, Roman politics and Byzantine politics was pretty brutal. This really is gonna have, it's the city of Sarantine has kind of the corruption, the decadence, but also the glory and the beauty that you would expect to see in the city of cities. And while he is the protagonist and is gonna have a huge amount of impact on a bunch of people and really do some important stuff, we will also follow a huge cast of characters: emperors, empresses, senators, physicians, dancers, chefs, chariot racers, couriers, guards, nobles, soldiers, an alchemist. Just really all kinds of people who really just leap off the page. And one thing I have to mention about these books is structurally, chapter by chapter, it is going to read differently than most things you read. And the first, and this won't be that different for a lot of epic fantasy fans, Malazan fans, people who've read some later Wheel of Time books, final bit of Stormlight books, he POV hops like an absolute madman. This is like Malazan Book of the Fallen level of POV hopping. It's a lot of POV hopping that was handled beautifully well. The chapters, and this is what I mean by structurally, it has extremely long chapters, and this is one of the books where I'm going to forgive having extremely long chapters, because a lot of the time for extremely long chapters, it really just feels like you read one long chapter and it just feels like you read 7 normal length chapters that just didn't get split up. Each of these chapters feels all like self-contained in its own little way. In general, it's very rare that you will finish a chapter in one person's POV, then you'll start the next chapter in like the middle of something, or really at all, and then you'll start the next chapter and it will be the same person's POV directly after that. Which may sound like it could get confusing, but there's some serious black magic fuckery going on here. Because in general what happens is you'll get to a new chapter and you will start with multiple characters in multiple different positions that could be people you knew already, it could be a new character, who knows, and they seem unrelated, but then they come together in a way that feels completely natural, and you understand what's going on. And you kind of get this, you get the sense of what the narrative it's trying to tell. Sometimes the various places you start for the beginning of a chapter will connect literally, like they will literally talk to each other. They're right next to each other. Sometimes they're more connected by an idea. I have an example of this because a lot of the times the chapters will begin with some omniscient narration. Because for those of you who have not watched my Guy Gavriel Kay video, especially my Lines of Hours On video, you will not know that Guy Gavriel Kay, he's kind of in the point in his writing where he knows all the rules of how things are supposed to work, and he knows them well enough that he can start breaking them. This will, if you play chess, you'll know what I mean for this. Probably a lot of things, but for me, I think of chess. There are some moves that you see people make when they just have no idea what they're doing, and then you learn what they're doing, and it's like, okay, that breaks a general rule. But then you look at super grandmaster games, and they make the moves that you learned not to make because they know in this specific instance it works. So I will say he will have a mix of different viewpoints, even different tenses. And I could see it taking getting used to. I think it does add to the story. I think the way he uses it, I would try and just not think about it that much. He's going to get you to have a certain feeling from reading it in that specific way. And I don't think this book would be as good if it was just third-person limited past tense. I think he makes it work in a way that's really, really interesting. And as an example of I deliberately didn't use this for the intro. Also because, for the dramatic intro, it has never been harder to narrow it down. Normally, as I'm reading books, I'll just note page numbers. If I get to a quote, then I'm like, that could be good for a dramatic intro. I kind of do it for everything now, even if I don't expect to do an intro. I used to not do that, but I find the Goodreads quotes tend to just not be super good for books that, even for really popular books. Like, The Way of Kings' most liked Goodreads quotes is a travesty. If I do a Stormlight intro, they are going to be so much better than the Goodreads quotes. Anyways, we're off topic again. But I have an example of him starting a chapter with some omniscient narration, and then the chapter is going to, after this, go to seemingly unconnected point of views, and they are going to, and this, the idea here, whether you want to call it a theme or just an aspect, whether it be supernatural, and you don't really directly told whether this is supernatural or that's actually happening or superstitious, is going to connect the chapter, the content of this chapter. So narration, go, editing me, cue the dramatic music. Men and women were always dreaming in the dark. Most of the night's images fell away with sunrise, or before if they harrier the sleeper awake. Dreams were longings, or warnings, or prophecies. They were gifts or curses, from powers benevolent or malign. For all knew, whatever faith into which they had been born, that mortal men and women shared the world with forces they didn't understand. There were many who plied a trade in city or countryside, telling those troubled by visions what they might signify. A small number saw certain kinds of dreams as actual memories of a world other than the one into which the dreamer and the listener had been born to live and die. But this was treated in most faiths as black heresy. As winter turned towards spring that year, a great many people had dreams they were to remember. So yeah, you'll get omniscient narration like that, and then the chapter will connect back to that. And that aspects of that narration will end up being important. So, if you're going to go into this, expect that. This is, find Guy Gavriel Kay hard to recommend, but I want to recommend it to people anyways. Because it seems a lot of people can just not mesh with his writing style. But the people who do mesh with his writing style tend to love it. And so, he's a lot of people, among their favorite authors, and a lot of people just read one of his books and give it 2 stars and move on with their life. Which, whatever, I love them, and I think more people love them than dislike them, and especially if you're fans of series like Malazan or like A Song of Ice and Fire. Maybe Lord of the Rings. Maybe Realm of the Elderlings. I expect you will like these a lot more. But I would even recommend trying them. Like, I'd recommend trying a Guy Gavriel Kay book. Maybe not Sarantine. Maybe Tigana or The Lines of Our Song. But they really are worth trying. The man really does know what he's doing. I get that they're not for everyone, but I think if they're good enough that I'm gonna be kind of like, I'm confident enough in their quality that if someone doesn't like them, I'm kind of like, no, okay, wasn't for you. They're very high quality, well written books. Anyways, as an example for structurally what kind of stuff you're getting into, I think for Sarantine, if you haven't read any Guy Gavriel Kay, if what I'm about to describe sounds not great, I would probably start with Tigana, which is a slightly more straightforward narrative. Not a simple narrative, but more straightforward structurally. But if what I described to you here sounds amazing, I think starting with the Sarantine Mosaic would be a great idea. So, the start of this book starts with the death of the Emperor. The Emperor who has been the Emperor for a long time, but has no living, competent heirs, because unlike some other monarchies, emperors would generally, if they had children who were jackasses, they would just be like, yeah, you're not the heir, I'm just going to adopt someone, and they're the heir, except for some emperors. Damn it, Marcus Aurelius, Commodus being emperor was a bad idea. Whatever. And it starts with that, and then it goes to some seemingly completely unrelated point of views. Like, it jumps in the prologue, and it just feels like, oh, it's going to something else now. And then there are also some POVs it jumps to that seem like, okay, this seems like someone is related to the story of, all the scheming and backstabbing and shitstorm that's going to result from an emperor with no heirs dying. But then, like some kind of black magic, all these different POVs just like connect and are all important, and your brain suddenly understands what happened, and also like the impact this would have on day-to-day life to normal people without directly being told, because man is a wizard. Anyway, also, this is a somewhat introspective book. There's not going to be like much in terms of battle scenes. I actually almost wish Guy Gavriel Kay would write more action, because I actually think he writes action really well. And this does have some action, but none of very little action. Has less action than Tigana, Arbone. It's the series that has the least action of all the Guy Gavriel Kay stuff I've read so far. I almost do wish he would write more. I do actually think he writes action really well. But whatever. This is very low action. It's a very introspective book. To quote George R. R. Martin quoting Faulkner, it's very much a lot about the conflict with the human heart and conflict with itself. But it's kind of, I almost think the premise of this book is like, during moments of big sweeping change, the stuff that's actually important to the people there is gonna be like not the big moments, but that doesn't mean there aren't moments of big sweeping change and significant individual things that happen that will ripple out and affect the course of history for thousands of years. But it manages to cover both really well, but definitely focuses more on kind of the more character stuff and less what happened in history. Something else that's also worth mentioning, this does have more supernatural elements than a book like The Lines of Our Song, which The Lines of Our Song you can almost read and not notice there's supernatural stuff. There is some supernatural stuff in The Lines of Our Song, but it's very subtle. This one definitely has more supernatural stuff, both in just the city of Sarantine, and it also has kind of some more mythical stuff. The supernatural stuff, it isn't like actiony supernatural stuff. It's not going to be like, Mistborn or like Harry Potter or like wizards shooting fireballs. There are actually kind of some fireballs. Anyways, that's a different story. There's Sarantine fire, which is like Greek fire because the Byzantine Empire was a little bit more Greek than the Roman Empire was. Anyways, that's unrelated. But there is more magic. Like, this is a series that you can't really read this series and think it has no magic, but it's still firmly low magic fantasy. I also do want to talk about some of the main themes that this book covers somewhat generally. So if these specifically sound like something that you think would connect to you, you can maybe know to start with this book. And I think, to me, the most important one probably for the first book, for Sailing to Sarantium, is kind of... So our protagonist is obviously an artist, and Guy Gavriel Kay loves artist characters. Basically, every book has some kind of art form playing a key role. Like, Tigana has singing, Our Raison has poetry, Arbonne has, like, troubadours. This has mosaics and mosaicics. But you really see a lot of people in professions that we would not consider to be artists, who really strive for excellence because they see what they do as art. They want to do these things they're doing to create something beautiful and create what they see as art just for the sake of excellence. Like, it's excellent for the sake of excellence. So it's like there's a chef character who, you know, sees the cooking he does as like a form of art. Like, he just wants it to be excellent. Like, even if he was cooking for no one, he would still want it to be excellent. You even like chariot racers, maybe even the emperor, an architect, all kind of stuff like that. And I think it can be very powerful in a lot of ways. And also legacy. People trying to leave a legacy is an important part of this book. It is one of the main things about a mosaicist, where it was seen as the more permanent form of artwork. And one of the reasons the emperor wants a mosaic is they want something permanent, something to be remembered by. We also have people just in general trying to, even if they don't have children, try to leave someone who they see as their heir. Like, the chef is trying to find a cook who can kind of continue his legacy, and who even can exceed his legacy and be a part of theirs. And as I've mentioned, the importance of personal narratives during important historical moments, which very much I think is almost the idea behind a lot of Guy Gavriel Kay's historical stuff, that just the facts of what happens historically tell you very little of what it would be like to be there during that time, because the facts of what happens with the main narratives ignores the millions of people and all of their personal narratives, which really are the more important narratives in the sum. Like, there's no, maybe you can argue that for history, like, one person's own little struggles aren't as important as, like, the effects that a nation is going to have. But in aggregate, all the personal struggles are vastly more important, and they're not the ones that we remember, because they're not the ones that get written down, and because you can't learn them. And just seeing those and the way he writes those is really, I think, a big appeal to his book. So, what does this duology do well? Well, if I were to split this into the sections like I did for some of my old reviews, how far are we into this review? 27 minutes plus the intro. Oh no. See, this is why I can't now have a character's plot, theme, world, and action setting. But pretty much all of those are great, in my opinion. I think, in terms of characterization, this is his strongest work yet, and I think it is not particularly close. This book and series does not have a dramatis personae. For some reason, Tigana and Our Raison did. I still want a dramatis personae, despite what I'm about to say, because it does throw a lot of characters at you, and those characters don't have names that you would see in modern society because they have names that you would see from someone who lived in the Sarantine Empire, which is based on the Byzantine Empire, or Bassanid, which is based on the Sassanid Empire. That being said, I literally, basically never got people confused with each other, despite it having a really large cast of characters. I literally cannot think of a time reading these books other than, the first time you see someone where I saw a name and I was just like, who the hell is that? It's because he does this with every book, where it feels like every single character feels like a protagonist. They're all given the attention they deserve. They're all given a story. And those stories, all weave together in a way that just doesn't make sense. We just happen to have the most page time for Crispin. So he's the protagonist. But you really feel like there is a main story for, all these different characters. And he even does the thing, because of course he does, where you get to the start of Lord of Emperors, and he's just like, boom, completely new character that you're going to get a ton of time on. And by the end of the book, I'm like, I love this character. He's great. And the setting, Kay does his research so well, and he makes the settings not just feel like a backdrop. He's not just telling whatever story of characters who, could live in the modern day with how they think and talk and see the world, that just, happen to be set in a city that it is described to look similar to how Constantinople would look in the 6th century. The people who live here feel like they think in a way that people would think if they lived in this world. Also, I just really like Roman-based stuff. This isn't quite ancient Rome. I would still like some kind of Punic War, or Julius Caesar, or Third Crisis of the 3rd Century Guy Gavriel Kay book, because Rome is my favorite setting. But this is still, there's Roman stuff here, and I like that. And the plotting, it's very, I think Guy Gavriel Kay's plotting is actually really exquisite. I don't think he's one of these, I don't think he's a writer who has really good prose, but his storytelling isn't very good. It's not a fast plot. I would describe it as a meticulous plot, because while it's never rushed, it's also never repetitive. I don't think there's a scene that is just doesn't provide anything new, or it just feels like a rerun of something we already got. And the attention to detail coming down the stretch, and really for the entire book, is just staggering while not being overwritten. I've said this before, he's like a scene-setting prose sniper, where he can fit in so much detail and vividness with just the perfect grouping of words, and the way things unfurl, and details that were in there are important, and things that seem unconnected, come together, is just genius. And the way the story and the plot are pushed by both, characters making decisions and being themselves, but also random chance, because random chance is a huge element in our life in a way that feels plausible and not cheap, is just so good. You can tell I like these books. I'm gonna be sad when I see someone I know read them and not like them as much, but they're so good, and I don't care, and I will be happy when I convince people to read them who completely love them the same way that I do. And that leaves, I've already talked about theme, but the prose. Holy crap, that's all I have to say. I have noticed for almost every Guy Gavriel Kay book that it takes a chapter or two for his prose to really hit a stride. Where maybe for the first 100 pages it's only very good, but then for Lord of Emperors it's it just kept going, and it just kept getting better and better and better and better, and holy crap, he wrote the ever-loving shit out of Lord of Emperors. You know how you could feel when an author is in their prose groove, and it's just so absurdly good. His writing it's just so vivid and emotional. It's like lyrical and poetic, and it's clear and smooth. I don't need to reread things because I read a section describing something and I can't picture or don't understand what happened. It's just there. Okay. And lastly, the chariots. Yes, this gets its own section, because after reading this book, I want us to bring back chariots into modern life. It makes no sense how compelling the chariot races are. I will read this man write fictional chariot racings over watching actual sports on television visually that are real and are actually happening. Okay. So what's not to like? I would like to preface this what not to like section is going to end with me praising it anyways. And I just want you to prepare for that. This is not things I disliked about it. One of it is. The other things didn't bother me. This is just what could lead to people not liking it. And the first is, there is no, like, epic showdown. If you look at the most common, like, the biggest fandoms on BookTube, for authors that are, like, releasing books. But, I mean, less so for, this is more, Song of Ice and Fire doesn't have as many epic showdowns, but it still has some. But, like, if you look at Sanderson or, like, Erickson, the end of those books, or with the Wheel of Time, they tend to have these, like, epic showdowns that are great and I love. And you know what? This book, this story does not have that. I think the climaxes and the resolutions and the conflicts are deeply powerful, but they're quieter stuff. They're more backstabby. Sometimes they're chariot races. Sometimes they're art related. Sometimes they're character moments. Don't expect a really, like, a battle between people as the climax of these books, because you're not going to get it. And speaking of climaxes of these books, the only thing that I would consider an actual criticism for this story is that this book doesn't have a climax. This book just ends. Now, I like every chapter of this book. It's not like the last two chapters aren't good chapters. They just don't feel like the last two chapters for a book. They feel like the middle chapters of a really long book. And so, as a result, Sailing to Sarantine does not stand on its own particularly well, which is why it has the lowest rating that I would give to, like, one of the historical Guy Gavriel Kay books. I still like it quite a bit more than all three Fiona Var books, which you can't even see. I don't know why I'm pointing to. They got relegated to that shelf because I don't like them as much. I still really like them, but I don't like them nearly as much. But I'll take any of the other historical-based books so far that I have read over this on its own. Not because it's written worse, but just because it does not tell a complete narrative. But as a whole, as one book, I don't really have cons for it. I will say, repeat, it does throw a lot of names at you. So I think if you're a fantasy veteran, if you've read, like, Wheel of Time, Stormlight, A Song of Ice and Fire, or Malazan Book of the Fallen, or I mean, even First Law has quite a few characters, Sun Eater has quite a few characters. Be kind of weird if you've read Sun Eater and not any of those other series, although if that's the case, I really like you and you're cool, but you should read those other series, they're really excellent as well. But it does kind of throw quite a few characters at you, so maybe would not be a good entry point to fantasy, but for people who, you know, are into fantasy and are just looking for more fantasy books, I think it's amazing. Because, you know, stylistically, Guy Gavriel Kay is not an author that is for everyone. I don't really know why, but that's because just I love them. But, you know, maybe his writing style won't work for you, but if it does, and it's going to be very similar, well, like, Guy Gavriel Kay's writing, it always feels slightly different for every book he's written, probably just because it kind of fits the setting in some way, but it's still distinctly Guy Gavriel Kay, and if you like the style, I think these are going to be a home run. These are a lot of people's favorite Guy Gavriel Kay works, and that includes me. The individual scores, if you care about the books, I gave this 9.2, and I give this 9.7, but this is mostly just 9.2 because I'm rating it as a complete novel. I think it's like, it's better as the first half of a big novel than it is as a complete novel. Like, for example, if you were to take the first half of Words of Radiance and say this is a complete novel, I would probably be more harsh on it as half a novel than I would be as the first half of a bigger novel because it's trying to do something else. I gave this 9.7 out of 10, and I've considered bumping it up to 9.8. It's my highest 9.7, and I might bump it up to 9.8 in hindsight because I think it is, like, it's growing on me and getting even better. And as a whole, I'd give them a higher score than the average. Like, if this was a standalone book, I would give this, like, 9.6 out of 10, maybe even 9.7. Anyways, that's all I got. The Sarantine Mosaic. I hope I have hyped you for this book because I want you to be hyped on this. I want to see your comments that say that you have moved this up your TBR and that you're gonna read this soon. Okay? Read it soon because it's really good. And you know what? I want you all to read it, and I don't want, especially the people who've just read one Guy Gavriel Kay book and were like, this was really good, and then decided to stop because the only book they'd ever heard of was Tigana, so you assumed that the rest of it wasn't good. But it's great. Anyways, that's all I got for you. Holy crap, this is a 45-minute video about a duology. I'm not known for my brevity. Bye, everyone.